Alright, it's going.
Okay.
So far, your interview. I don't want to be interviewed.
You don't want to interview, okay. Ann wanted to have me talk a little bit about Dad, or their grandfather. And he lived a very unusual life. He was, when he was born, his doctor told his mother that he was not going to live beyond the age of 5 because of a health problem that he had. And so his mother didn't discipline him like a Japanese child because, you know, he's only going to live till 5, but why do any discipline? So she didn't discipline him. And then at 4 years old, there was one of these health vaccinators, and he said, and my great-grandmother, no, I guess my grandmother, told my dad that I'm going to have them have this incense burned on your hand, and it has a chance of curing you, so I want you to do it. But it's not because you've been naughty or anything else like that, but I want to try that. Well, he got it, and it actually cured him, so he was no longer on that do anything you want, and you know you'll never be scolded, because in that entire period, his parents never scolded him.
And when was he born?
He was born in 1867.
And when was I born?
1966.
1967. 100 years.
Yes.
Later.
That's right. Yeah, I do. Yeah. Right.
It's crazy. And how long did he live?
He lived till 94.
94. And he was supposed to live until 5. And
Right.
he lived till 94.
Right.
That's amazing.
And he was always on the intellectual side, and he wanted to be a lawyer. Well, he applied to the law school, and he lied his age. He said...
Is this in Japan?
In Japan, yes. And Japan was going through a major change in their legal system, so he was really excited about this change, and it was actually closer to the United States system than the Japanese system. So he got into law school at 16. In the first year, he was ranked, you know, in the middle of things. And in the second year, he was ranked number 4th in his class of about 160 legal students. Well, what he found out was that if he was graduating at 18 with 3 years there, 19 there, that he couldn't be a lawyer because, a judge, because he was too young. You had to be 21 to be a judge. So he convinced the company to send him to the United States to understand the U.S. legal system, and that he would be able to update how the United States does their law and then exercise it in Japan, and they agreed to fund him. And so he came to San Francisco when he was 18 years old. He had gone to 2 years of law school, and then he came here, and they paid all the expenses to come here, and they were actually paying for all living expenses in the U.S. as well. And he was really happy about learning all these things happening over in this country. Well, this country made a bunch of bad decisions, probably one sending him to the United States, but the other one was they went bankrupt. So he became a schoolboy, and during this period, though, there was a huge epidemic, health epidemic in Ibaraki, where he was raised, and a majority of his classmates died. Oh. And so he told me that, you know, he says he went back to his room, put a sheet over his head. Seriously, he was thinking of suicide, and because, you know, he's just, the people who mattered so much to him had already died, and he was really became negative and was seriously thinking of suicide at that point. But the one thing he did that kept getting into his head were these missionaries on Market Street who were preaching Christianity. And that was when he changed to become a very strong Christian.
From Buddhist?
From Buddhist, yes. And I don't think he was a strong Buddhist, but that was the choice thing that that was there, and so that's where he was. And he said he definitely was thinking of suicide though, because he just lost so many of the people who meant everything to him in his life.
Yeah.
And that's what converted him into Christianity and got him off of the track of this wonderful life that he had projected for himself, and this huge sadness. Then he met this woman whose mother was the head of the Women's Christian Temperance Union in Japan, and he told her he wanted to marry her, and he went back to Japan, and he thought he was going to be rejected. That's what he told me, but he asked that they allow his wife to work to marry him, and they were positive. So they got married, and Dad was always more interested in law. That was his real love of things. But his wife says, "Oh, don't do that. You can't make any money as being a lawyer." He says, they sold I think cloth or something like that in the family, and so he said, "That's what you should go into business." So they actually sold art goods they got married and they sold art goods in San Francisco. And then the 1906 earthquake occurred in San Francisco, and he lost everything. So the building was gone. They actually lived where the Geary Theater is today.
Wow.
And so he actually went to the Wells Fargo Bank where he borrowed money, and he says, and the guy says, "You don't have to pay us back. We have lost all our records." And he says, "Well, I have my records, so I'll pay you back." And he actually paid them back in 1913.
Yeah.
So it was a while after that, but his real belief was there. He actually went bankrupt 3 times. The second time was when he went into the wholesale business and never went back to the art business after the earthquake. And then these longshoremen wanted to strike, and instead of leaving it on the ship, would have been insured, they actually took it off the ship and they burned everything, his entire inventory on the side. And the third one was during the Depression in the early 30s when they had that. So those are the 3 times. And at that time, he decided that, if I weren't in debt, I wouldn't be bankrupt. So he ran all his businesses on positive cash flow, and didn't grow as fast as he would have had he done that. But he was a very strong Christian, and a very strong believer in Christianity. And one of the things about that was strange to people was when World War II started, they arrested 11,000 Japanese, and J. Edgar Hoover had this list of people, and what they were, hadn't done things properly in terms of how they did business and so forth in relationship to the Japanese. And some of them didn't do that much bad, but J. Edgar Hoover thought it was bad, so it didn't matter. That's what happened. Mm-hmm. And the strangest thing was people would come to our house, and everybody assumed Dad would be in the jail, but Dad wasn't, because he number one, didn't really favor these social type of groups, number one, and number two was that his belief and understanding of law was paramount to his life. So he never did anything that was illegal, or that way. And that's had a very strong influence on my life. And I actually was going to be a lawyer because of that.
And how you fell into physics.
So that was what happened, and when we were put into camps, we actually we're going to avoid going to camp. We actually moved to Fresno's, and then they said, oh, everybody in Fresno has to go into camp. So we moved to Visalia, and Teru, my sister, was the second youngest daughter of Dad, and she was in Visalia, and then Sim, who was his second son, his family was there, and she and Sachiko, they were nurses, and they lived in Visalia. So all of us lived there, and then they said, well, you're going to have Visalia, you have to go to camp. And Dad says, well, if I'm going to camp, I want to go into the one that the people in Berkeley, the people in the church were in. So they said, okay, we'll send you to Tamfran. I had a sad story during that. I went to a birthday party and had diarrhea the entire bus trip from Visalia to a Tamfran racetrack. And we were put into a horse stable.
Are those the holding assembly centers?
What?
Those are the assembly centers?
Yeah. It was an assembly center. And they built some temporary houses, but they also put people in the horse stables, and Dad kept making remarks about that. And I was really fortunate in that the lady next door to me actually ran a restaurant in San Francisco, and I couldn't eat anything, and she would bring me gruel and things like that, and really saved my life. So
how long were you in town for?
We were there, I think, about 9 months.
Wow.
And they built a camp in Abraham, Utah, which is called Topaz. And that's where we were. And I think there were around 10,000 people in that camp. So, and incidents that would happen is that they would have a scorpion, a huge scorpion, in front of the restaurant where we ate, and showing that this is what you find there, and stories like, and if you turn the lights out, the scorpions are on the ceiling, and when you turn the lights out, they fall down and bite you. You know? I've never seen that happen, but anyway, this is what were kind of wonderful stories that we were fed.
Yeah. Who fed those to you? Who was feeding the stories?
Well, they have them posted, so you never knew who. They have
written,
a wall
on
the wall, and they have this huge scorpion there, you know.
That's
there,
so
do that.
Okay.
So we went there, and the schools, Berkeley at that time was the best school in California, and I was going through these other schools like in Fresno and Visalia, which was really, I wasn't learning anything. Yeah. And then camp we were in Utah, and the reason I had the name Bob is, you know, she said, what's your name? Shinobu Togasaki, and, you know, whatever. And she couldn't remember any of them, so she just automatically, this is your name, and I got Bob. And that's why I became Bob Togasaki.
That's fun.
But, camp was really something, and a lot of people think I came out of it better than most other people.
How old were you?
I was 9.
And you were there for how long in the Topaz?
2.5 years.
Okay, wow, 9.
And then, but the greatest thing for me was my dad was actually, they had a group of 5 people who were key in terms of decision making for the Japanese. And Dad was one of them, and he was also very close to some of the people at Bolt School of Law, and they actually sent him a lot of documents. And so during the entire time we were in camp, he was working on the case of how to defend against the evacuation. And so I was getting closer, and I actually read a lot of the things that he had got. Some of which I didn't understand, but anyway, it was 9. Yeah, right. I was 9. But the thing about it was, you know, when he had a clarity. Like I'd say, well, why? How do you win a case like this? He says, well, the United States has 3 forms of government. There's the executive, legislative, and judiciary. The the judiciary hasn't made up its mind, but the executive and the legislative already have, right? So what I need to do is to win against the judiciary, because that's the way the United States legal system works. And that type of logic was hugely positive to me. And he really believed in it, and he understood it quite well. And so I'd work with him on a lot of the papers he was writing. And one of the things that was interesting was that after I came back to California, and skipping ahead right now, was that a lot of people say that you are very different in terms of how you accepted the evacuation than anyone else I know. And the reason was Dad. Was that
what was the difference in how you accepted it?
Because he looked at it as real objective enemies, that all Americans are bad, or this is the thing that he had the segmentation of the three and the actions that were taken, because the dominant reason that we were evacuated was not the war. The reason was that the Japanese farmers were working a lot harder and could sell or produce material much cheaper than the competition could. And so when the Japanese left, prices went zooming up, okay, and they didn't improve in their quality, but they certainly improved in terms of their revenue. And that was one of the things that they wanted, to get the Japanese out in order to...
I was reading a little bit too, and I read that they were actually had a severe labor shortage when all those people, all the farmers were thrown into camps. They were actually taken out of the camps to actually work in the farms and then sent back. I just read that.
Yeah, I don't know. It could be true, but...
Yeah, I don't know. But that sounds just so crazy.
Well, because there were very few camps in California.
Yeah.
Because we were all moved out to Utah, and
right.
they certainly didn't drag us from Utah to California.
Yeah, I don't know. I read that. But
and I don't know, they might have gotten some labor somewhere else too.
Well, certainly the Mexican, immigrants.
Well, they used to have a lot of the Mexicans.
Yeah.
Anyway, that wasn't a change. That was and the intensity may have changed, but not the doing of it.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's what was there, and I think my fortune was living with Dad and his looking at it as legal issues rather than emotional issues. I think kept me a lot saner about the entire experience, and also I was also the first Dad was really good. Well, we moved to Salt Lake City, and then my mother was not very well, and so his excuse was, because of her health, we'd like to move to Salt Lake, and they let us move to Salt Lake, and even there we bought a house, and they had decided they wouldn't sell houses to Japanese, but the real estate agent's mother says, you can use my name. So we bought a 2-bedroom house for $5,000, and then we moved in there, and it was interesting. The Mormons came over and said, well, you can't be full Mormon, so you can't be really members of the church, but you can attend these meetings, and you can't attend these meetings. And then Dad gave him a royal election because he had studied Mormonism and not exactly complimentary about their religion. But during that time in Salt Lake, what was interesting to me was how well they treated me. They used to pay 50 cents or something like that to go to events, movies, and so forth. And all of that was free for me. And they let me go to these parties and things like that. And they didn't because they were highly prejudiced against by other white non-Mormons, right?
And so they were sympathetic to your situation.
It actually turned out that worked, and then Dad wanted to go back to California, and so my idea was, well, I hope that happens soon. And I was the first. He got permission to move back to Berkeley, to our home in Berkeley, and we did that during the war. In fact, I was the only Japanese student in the California school system
Wow.
because there were no others that
Wow.
got the permission. And I didn't go. I was in the 7th grade then, so I was in the junior high school. I was no longer in the elementary school. And I went there, and the advisor was really a good advisor. He says, what's happened to you is wrong. It shouldn't have happened to you. But, there are thousands of Japanese that are going to be coming back, and you're the first one. And so they're going to be watching you. And if you take a hard attitude, which I can understand why you would do it, but it could really hurt every Japanese student that returns.
Wow.
And another positive, I consider that positive, and was that my friends were just so glad to see me. It was just, it wasn't like I was going into a foreign area. No, now they were coming from 4 elementary schools, but they were the ones that knew me before treated me well, and so accepted me and so forth. So that was also
it's a lot of
a
responsibility.
fortunate positive. Yeah, well, but it was, if I went to school in Oakland or some other city, none of that would have occurred. And so I'm talking about a blessing, not a
sure.
not
No,
a
I'm just saying it's a lot of responsibility for a little kid.
Yeah, well, yeah, and the counselor was really good about it. He says, if you don't do that, I'm not sure I'd blame you.
Sure.
But I really think that for the Japanese, I think there's a huge difference. You're the only example of a Japanese that we have in our schools in California. So that was, and that I thought that was a very good speech given me. And I actually wasn't planning to be anything but that, but the concern of the school itself and how they dealt with me was I thought a positive. And Dad's influence on me during that entire period was a very positive one, of where the way I thought about the evacuation was much more pragmatic, I think, than most adults. And so that didn't influence me as much as it did a lot of other people in camp, and a lot of people, both Caucasians and Japanese, have said that to me, is that you handle it totally different from anybody else I've known. And which was, I think, dominantly attributable to Dad in terms of what he did. So when we were back, what he was working on was a case for making the evacuation an illegal offense. And he worked on that, and we had, oh God, I can't remember his name right now, but he volunteered to, for the Supreme Court, you have to be pass a bunch of examinations and tests and education before you can plead before the U.S. Supreme Court. And this person volunteered to represent the Japanese Americans, and the Japanese Americans in a case making the evacuation illegal. And so he says, I'll do it for free.
Wow.
And he later became Secretary of State. And Dad worked with him, and Mike Masaoka, who was the key Japanese advocate for Japanese relationships, was in Washington, D.C., and he was our representative. And Reader's Digest wrote him up as the best lobbyist in Washington.
Wow.
And his ethics and so forth were just incredibly positive of doing things as well. And so I spent some time in Washington and developed a very negative attitude towards the majority of Congress people. And there were some that I had very high respect for, but the majority, if I watch England and U.S., I mean, the delta is so high that it's unreal. So that was an interesting experience and something that convinced me that I don't ever want to be a politician as long as I live. That's the last
I'm
thing.
glad too.
Thank you. I don't think it would have been positive. And I don't think I would have been any good.
What happened to Grandpa's first wife? She passed away.
Well, yeah, it was. There are actually 9 children, and 8 from his first wife. And there was a family that was having their sons was married, and they were. I think they're at the Tokyo Hotel. They were at a Tokyo hotel, and Dad's first wife and the bride both died from eating like some raw fish
Oh my god.
thing.
That's so weird.
Oh yeah. and Dad, I don't know.
Wow.
Can't remember what the thing was that they ate, but it had poison in it, and
Blowfish?
might have been.
Yeah. Fuku.
Yeah, yeah, but it was, and so they both died. And the bride died at the
Yeah,
wedding.
that's horrible.
Those two.
That's horrible.
And
Wow.
Dad never ate raw fish, and I didn't know why until I was in my 20s.
Yeah.
And that's when he told me. You know,
How old was she? Do you know?
I don't know. She was actually older than he was,
Okay.
and so.
Anyway.
Yeah, that's why that's how she died. It was just a horrible thing. And the bride died too. Can you imagine dying at your wedding?
That's pretty awful.
Oh yeah. So, and she's the one that wanted him to stay in business, you know. And Dad never. I don't think he really liked that much. I know he didn't like it that much. He was much happier working on the evacuation claim case than on. You agree, huh?
It's okay. It's okay. All right. Where are we? Okay.
So that was basically, yeah. The Dad's marriage, his wife was very activist in terms of helping people and so forth, and there's 8 children besides me. The oldest is Kiyoshi, and he worked for Dad in the office, and then the second son was Susumu, and in between them was Kazue. She was the oldest doctor. There are 2 boys and 6 girls in the original family.
Is Kyoshi and then Kazue, Uncle Sam.
Yeah.
Kyoshi? Cherry?
No, let's see.
Whoops.
See, the youngest is Yai,
Yeah.
and then it's Teru, then
Chie.
Chie, yeah,
Or Chie.
Chie Mitsue,
Oh, Mitsue is on this.
yeah. I think Mitsue is the second oldest daughter, and then Yoshie, Chie, Teru, and Yai.
Got it.
And the youngest is
You.
24 years older than me. Yai is 24 years older than I am.
Wow.
And then Kiyoshi was born in 1995. He was the youngest. And I was born in 1932.
He was born in 85?
1985, right.
Or 18, no.
1895.
1895.
95.
Wow. Big generation gap.
Yes. Yeah, and that was a period of where there weren't many Japanese in the United States.
Right.
And so they were the oldest family, and so he did a lot of organizational work for the YMCA and Boy Scouts and things like that. And all of those were actually started by Kiyoshi.
Oh wow. I like the story of at Channing Way when at Halloween, and they would come trick or treating, and he would give them vegetables.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Yeah.
That's funny.
And then Sim would go out, Susuma would go out, and if they didn't give him anything, then he'd leave sewer or animal releases on their doorstep and says, "Well,
really?
yeah." It's just,
Uncle Sim did that?
Yeah. Oh, he was.
That's
he used
terrible.
firecrackers,
That's terrible.
in the 50s until he lost his sight. He did firecrackers. He'd get him to go to Chinatown and bring firecrackers.
He's like the family delinquent.
Oh yeah, me and Yaya were the two, and Kazuo was actually the mother. She all the cooking and everything else of the family, all that was all managed through Kazuo. And so it was, and Yaya, the wild ones were Yaya and Sim were the two.
I could see that. The youngest. Well, I guess Sim.
Yaya was the youngest, and Sim was actually the third.
The youngest boy.
No, me.
Well,
right after Kiyoshi, right? Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, so that was.
It's a lot of kids.
And he was pretty wild that way. Great driver. And let's see. As far as Dad goes, I think he would have been much happier being in the legal side than in the business side. And he ran an incredibly honest business. He went bankrupt 3 times, but paid off his bankruptcy loans all 3 times. And then he says, "Well, if I didn't have debt, I wouldn't be bankrupt." And so he actually ran Mutual Supply so that he would end up with 0 debt. And so when the war started, he had no debt. And everything was paid for. And the government, in fact, on December 7th, my mother was sick, and so I stayed home, and Dad and Sim went to a church meeting that we had on the first Sunday of every month. And so on the way back, he turned on the radio and heard about the bombing. And they drove to the store, and the store was sealed by the FBI. And so they couldn't even get into the store then. And so it was a pretty hairy time of where, like shortwave radios, samurai swords, guns, and bunch of these things, you had to turn them all into the police station. And like in Berkeley, when we tried to do it, it was like around the block, and people did that. And so they said, "Well, you can come back tomorrow." And says, "No, we want to do it tonight." And they actually spent most of the night there, just giving them all the stuff that was there. So it was done in quite honest form. And but they did things like, while we were at Salt Lake, they froze Dad's bank account.
Yeah.
So you could not take any money out of the bank. And then they said, "We want the rental back on all the houses you've rented people." And he says, "Well, I have a bank account, but I can't write a check, so I can't send you pay for it." And he says, "Well, you can write 1 check." So he actually wrote 1 check, and he paid back all the money that was spent in rent.
Yeah.
So at that time, we had to borrow money, and the JCL actually lent us money without that. But it was like we didn't know what was going to happen, and it was for a number of years we never got that money back until we were actually in Berkeley before we ever got it back. And then they took fees for managing the money.
That's amazing.
That was there. So that was
not good.
No, not a.
So you had to rebuild everything, start from scratch.
Yeah, well, we were renting our house for $55 a month, the Channing Way house,
Yeah.
a huge house.
Yeah.
So we moved. So they allowed us to move back, and then Dad got him to says, well, look, the furnishing wasn't included in the price of the house, so take $10 off. So we were paying $45 a month rent on our house, and we never did get that back.
No, just to be clear, you paid rent to stay in your own house.
Right.
That's so ridiculous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then when they settled, it was
The reparations? Or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then they took a bunch of the costs out of saying, well, these are the actual costs that we incurred in doing it. So they actually subtracted a lot of the money from the rental. And so we never got the rent back. And it was...
yeah, hard to believe.
Yeah, and it was... being Dad's son, to me, was a real blessing, those things. But that was never the key concern that he had in this thing. He was more concerned about the legal actions taken and so forth, of how things were done and why they were wrong and so forth, And that was...
Good
kept a
values.
perspective
Right.
that was much stronger to me than, the $45 that we weren't going to get back.
Sure.
Giving him every month.
Right.
And
So how old was he when you were born?
Well, he was born in 1867,
Right.
and I was born
32.
in 1932. So.
Yeah.
And my mother was
65.
born in 1988.
65, that's old.
Yeah,
To have
and my
a
mother was in
baby.
her 40s. So.
That's pretty old to have a baby.
Yeah.
Whew. All right.
But his thinking was really, had a really positive influence to me.
Yeah.
And during the war, he wanted to know what I was going to do when I graduated.
So what made you decide to not pursue law then? I mean.
Oh, yeah. What happened was I was going to go into law, and I started, did some work on the evacuation thing.
Yeah.
And so in fact, I took 3 years of Latin in order to understand, legal things. A lot of it was correlated to Latin. And then, so that was what I was planning to do. And then, in my freshman year at Duke, they had an examination about, your skills, thinking, and what you should be.
Oh.
And so my freshman year, I was planning to be a lawyer, although I did take a lot of science courses. And then there's a professional group that actually will interview you and work with you on what direction you should go. And the guy says, "Why do you want to be a lawyer?" And my test showed that science was a much better thing for me. And so, and the advisor there the chief advisor there actually wanted to interview me, so we talked, and he wanted to know why I wanted to be a lawyer. And then the way he talked me, kind of encouraged me out of it, was saying, what are you going to do if you win?
When?
The case, right?
That case.
Against the government.
Oh, right. That one case.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like he says, if you win, what other case do you care about?
Yeah, I know, retire. Yeah.
And he was really good at doing this whole thing
right.
of dealing with that way, and I think he really cared. And he says, I think from a science standpoint, your thinking is much closer to that than it is to law, and that you're not looking at a career, you're looking at an event.
Yeah.
And
right.
that was the big thing.
That's
and then,
very astute.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and positive. It was a positive, really positive. So
Yeah.
it was there, and then and about that point, I was pretty much, I was getting weaker in terms of interest in
So
this
he was
thing.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but that kind of, you know, I mean, it was like a sharp right turn. It wasn't like a nibble, you know.
Yeah.
And what was really clear was that I really didn't know what I would do if we won.
Right.
You know, because I wasn't trying to get rich
Right.
getting people, you know,
Right.
to get this service, and that was never of interest.
Yeah.
I'm not interested in that kind of stuff anyway.
Yeah.
And so that's what did it. I spent one summer in Washington D.C. on the case, but again, it's an avocation, not as a vocation,
Right. Yeah.
and that was fairly satisfying.
Yeah.
So
Right.
it's more about me than Dad.
Yeah,
But
right.
Dad was you know, I told him I didn't want to be in the business, wholesale business. And I thought he was going to say something about, you know, a big smile comes on his face, you know, oh, good.
Oh, that's funny.
So it's not that I didn't look at the careers,
Yeah.
but I think I picked the right one. And that was, and I think IBM was really a good choice for me. I was actually thinking of being an actuary, and you can make a lot of money being an actuary. But it's not clear that I want to do that. I during my senior year at spring break, I went to talk to a large number of insurance companies. They all wanted to hire me. I got the highest. Actuary is the one that, you know, kind of decides what kind of policies you create.
Right. Yeah. I have a friend who does that.
And I took the examination in my sophomore year on actuary, given by the Actuarial Society, and I got the highest score in the country. So all these companies wanted to talk to me, you know, and then the more I talked to them, and watching the stuff that the lower people were doing, I said, I think I'd go insane. And then I went to IBM, and the excitement and energy there was so high, you know,
The innovation.
oh yeah, just there, and that's when I decided to switch, and when I was, they asked me what do I want to do. I said, well, I want to get a PhD in mathematics, and then I'll decide what to do. And he says, oh, that sounds like a great idea. He says, well, if you ever want to come to IBM, he says, senior vice president says, well, give me a call. And so that in my next year, I called IBM, and it was actually kind of late, and said, I'd like to get a job with you. And so they said, I'm sorry, we're all filled up. And then I wrote, says, well, you know, this vice president said I should contact him if I was interested in working for IBM. And then the next day I got a call from LA saying, oh, we found an opening.
That's pretty impressive.
So I worked down there, and that was a group of brilliant people working there who were not out to make money. They were really out to create a new business for IBM. And I think that education there was like over twice as much as I was learning out of Stanford. And so I told Stanford that if they doubled my income, I'd continue to teach, but if they didn't, I was going to quit. And
See ya.
they didn't double my income. So we didn't double my income, and then I couldn't believe it. This guy says to me, he says, Stanford University needs you. Like, you know, and I says, well, Stanford University can pay me.
Yeah.
And then I joined IBM, and that was, I thought,
That's so arrogant.
really. Oh yeah, right. But at Stanford, I know people don't know it, but outside of the professors, the pay is really low at Stanford.
Yeah.
It's incredibly low at Stanford. So, and I was actually solving real problems. You know, even in my first summer in LA, and so the excitement there was so much higher than university for 4 years and working with it, dissertations and so forth. So I says, oh, I'm leaving. So, and they were really ticked off at me for leaving, but I thought
you gave him a chance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they ignored it.
Yeah.
And then Dad, that was an interesting thing with Dad too, because I was, he was really happy when I said I was interested in law. Mm-hmm. And he showed me a lot of things while we were in camp, about law and so forth. So I know a fair amount about law now. Mm-hmm. But when I wanted to go to IBM, he was really positive because before I went, this summer, he said, with these 3 months you have for summer vacation, I'll pay for you to come back to Japan for the summer, and then you can come back and do that. And I says, well, if I get a job from IBM, I want to do that. If I don't, then I'll go back to Japan. Well, IBM hired me, so I didn't. So that's why I didn't go to Japan, and I totally changed my career plans. And that was really positive. I really thought that was very positive. And Dad was positive about that too.
Yeah.
He wasn't against that. In fact, he was pretty happy about it. So it was really funny. What does Dad know about IBM? He wouldn't be interested in that at all. And so I says, well, and he kept telling people about, how I was now at IBM, his son was at IBM. And it turns out it was the stock price of IBM was higher than any other company.
Oh.
And so that he understood.
That's funny. Businessman.
That was the first time I knew why he was interested in that. And I think that's the totality of it too.
Yeah.
But, and it had a good reputation in IBM in Japan too, so that was also positive. But that was not the plan.
Yeah. Okay.
So let's see. Dad was like in camp. One of the things was that there was a group of 5 leaders who were chosen, and he was one of them, in order to set the direction of camp. And there was a group of people who were really against that group, and they had threatened to kill him, kill Dad.
Jeez.
And so the FBI says, we'll drive you to the meeting and right back. He says, no, if they want to kill me, they kill me. But I knew that. So my mother and I both knew that, but we never didn't know it from each other, and knew that he had been threatened. And so he went to this meeting, and then all the others, the other 4, were actually driven home by the MPs. And we were sitting there, and we both knew, but we didn't ever mention it to each other that we knew in our barrack. And all of a sudden I heard this sneeze, and I knew that was Dad, so I ran out and hugged him. And they actually decided, he refused it, but they decided not to do anything. All done, huh?
Gotta let the princess in. All right.
So that was the life he left was really one of very interesting. His weaknesses. Like one was he always liked to speak at people's funerals.
Huh.
But he was never happy because everybody would say, what a wonderful person this person was.
Yeah.
And so he would always bring up something bad about the person, the weakness of the person.
To be funny or just...
No, because he believed that this was a human being, right? It wasn't a god that was, going to heaven. That's not what they were. And so, and he'd always go...
Let's not forget, this person's not perfect.
Right. And a lot of times in the funeral, that's all that is. Now, the good news was that, everybody knew he did it. It wasn't like, a surprise to anyone that happened. So I don't think the lasting impact was really low, versus someone who just did it to one person, right? But and most people couldn't say no to him. So.
Yeah.
And he'd give him a lot of money and so forth, the family, but he says, and if you look at the Bible and you look at a bunch of sinners here, right, all of a sudden the person is holy because he died it really irritated him a lot, and that's why he did it. So he had those characteristics that were not totally appreciated by the world. It's the only reason I'm bringing it up. But it was interesting. Life is finally he actually gave a 3-hour preached for 3 hours, and then he came home and had a stroke. And then there's a hospital that's right near there, St. Luke's, and so they took him into the hospital, and then Chia was there. He took him to the hospital, and the nurse said, "Well, what about Mr. Togasaki?" And he says, "Oh, let him die." And Chia couldn't take that, so she says, "I'm taking back the house." And they actually hired, well, she called Kazuo and says, "I'm going to hire 2 nurses." And so they actually had 2 nurses for him, and they were there, and he actually died about a year later.
He was in a coma the whole time? Or?
Close, yeah.
Oh,
I mean, he was either in a coma or close the entire time. And Dad being any other way and conscious, I think would have been totally negative. You know, and he lived till 94, and by the way, Chie and her husband Tamezo, changed their will that no actions would be taken if they ever went into coma. I mean, that's how strongly they felt about the actions that they had taken, because it wasn't like it was really hard anyway, and if Dad recovered in in any kind of sane state, he would have been miserable, because he liked to do everything and do things, and that, I think passing away was a much more positive thing. Going to heaven was not a negative for him at all. So that was.
So of the 9 children, who's the most like him? Because obviously I've never met him. He died 6 years before I was born.
Who's the most like him?
Is anyone?
The thing is, there's some characteristics that are there in people, but nobody is totally like him.
Interesting.
I think that his value system is in helping people and so forth. I'd say Kazuo was closest.
Really?
Yeah, she actually ran the family and Dad would argue with me and stuff, and she's really concerned that I'm getting frustrated about the whole thing. And then when she realized that I wasn't frustrated at all, she was really happy. I mean, from the soul, she was happy about that. It wasn't like a phoniness at all. It was really positive. And so she had characteristics that I think they were there, but hers were always positive. It's and I think we all have characteristics, but they're not like.
Sometimes there's some of the kids are just more like one parent than another.
Right. Yeah.
But
I mean, the people like Sim and Yaya were definitely not like him.
That we know.
Yeah, right,
They're off the list.
So you got I mean, it's not like it's a null set. So it's there. Kyoshi was incredible person and he was probably about the oldest Nisei in the U.S.
Yeah, probably.
And he did so much for the J community here, of forming things, and the YMCA thing, scouts and things like that, where he was very involved, and he wanted to have these events there, and they really worked hard. his first wife was, she was totally involved with the community in terms of helping things. And so she never worried about cooking or anything, you know. And, oh, don't you have to feed your children? Just, no, Kazuma does that. You know?
Wow.
And she did.
Wow.
So it was a very giving family in terms of helping others. And like Teru, she was the doctor in Salt Lake. I'm sorry, in Sacramento. And her attitude was, she didn't care if a patient paid. That never bothered her. And she'd work with them, and she'd make remarks about, I don't know why I'm not richer. She didn't care.
Yeah, no, I would
And
remember that.
if you, and Kazu's love of being an obstetrician was unbelievable. She you know, the joy of delivering a baby to her was so high that she never understood why she was paid. You know, it was just, that was so much of a pleasure to her. It was just unreal. And Yoshia was the logical one, and she actually was the first Japanese to graduate from Johns Hopkins Med School.
Yeah.
And her quality of medicine was just unreal. And she did most of her work for the government, through the government, state of California. And then she also went to, she was actually planning to go to Italy, where there's a whole bunch of Germans who lived there in southern Italy who had no doctors. They didn't even have a hospital. And she wanted to go there. And when the war started, she volunteered to join the army, medical, and she actually, her job was actually southern Italy. And she actually stayed in her house in Salt Lake on her way out, and Dad was really concerned. But it turned out that, you know, when she went over there were all these poor Germans, not Italians at all, and no hospital, nothing there. And she did an outstanding job there.
She's amazing.
But her and then when she came back here, she was head of pediatrics for the state, and that was in Berkeley. And then they moved it to Sacramento, and she said, I don't want to go to Sacramento, so she then took over pediatrics for the Contra Costa County. And she was an outstanding doctor.
Yeah. And to the end, I mean, she was constantly researching and learning, and all the way to the end of her life.
Yeah, and she was good at making things happen, you know, just incredible.
Yeah.
And just, she's
impressive.
She was probably the one that wanted to be married the most and didn't get married. And,
oh, really?
Yeah,
Yoshi?
Yeah.
Oh.
Kaza never wanted to be married.
Interesting.
And Teru had a lot of friends, but she never did get married. A lot of male friends.
Just Yaya for like a couple years.
Yeah, well, Yaya, Chia, and Mitsu.
Oh, Chia, that's right. Yeah, I forgot.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know them as well.
Yeah, so that was, and for Japanese men, you know, it's hard to get a person to marry a doctor if they're not a doctor.
Yeah, Togasaki women are kind of independent.
Yeah, I mean, if they were a doctor, I don't think they would marry them, whether they're Togasaki or not. Just,
right, no, just the whole...
Yeah, from structural, societal structure thing of the Japanese.
They're a boss.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And Kazuha never wanted to be married. That was not...
She had too much to do.
Well, and the children and so forth.
Yeah.
And she raised the family.
Yeah, right.
Much more.
She had all you to take care of.
Yeah, well, I wasn't there. I mean, it was just her real mother that was kept, you know, helping other people. And
right.
Said, why don't you help your family? Oh, no, Kazuha's doing that. That was her answer, right?
Yeah.
And she was.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
The ones who were the biggest problems was Yaya and Sim, I guess. They were and Kiyoshi, you know, in those days, if you were a U.S. citizen and you were married to a Japanese, your wife had to go back to Japan every 3 years, every third year.
Even if you're married?
Yep.
Wow.
If you weren't married, it's probably less of a problem, but the fact that turned out to be
Interesting.
and that's why Kirshi's wife, because they had 3 children, and then, after they're in school, she had to leave 2 of the children, well, I guess 2 children had to go to school, so they couldn't go back, and Bobby, who's actually just 3 weeks older than I am, she could take him back, but she didn't like this idea of abandoning her children in 1 out of 3 years. And so she got him to Japan, and before Bobby was 5, and when Gordon and Emiko were in school here, and he transferred over, so their entire education was in Japan, except for a few years for those. So that was a bad situation. And then after Sim, his wife was in the same problem, but and their children were younger. So Dad said, he says, okay, you're going to Japan, next year, so learn to type on a Japanese typewriter.
Yeah, right.
You roll it and go stump,
Yeah.
and you roll it and go stump. That's how Japanese typewriter works.
Yeah.
And but the whole thing is, when she came back here, he says, okay, I have an application for a typist, Japanese typist, And so they says, well, we'll have to find out if there's anyone who wants to be a Japanese typist that's a U.S. citizen. Unfortunately, nobody said yes. So she never went back to Japan. She stayed here, and the family was in sync. That was how he solved the. So this is Dad works on the legal problems very well.
Yeah.
So that was much of what his belief was, and he's a strong preacher, strong believer in Christianity, and he liked to help people, but he didn't like to be helped, and he felt that there were so many people who needed help here that he would be irritated that if they gave him anything, and he wanted them to give it to people who really needed help, not to just try to return something that he